when you think back to your time as Secretary General, what was the greatest challenge on assuming office for you?
I think getting to understand the capacity and the capability of the organization. My knowledge of the Secretariat was pretty much limited to the officers serving CMAG, which I had been part of for the previous few years. And outside of that, I didn't really have an appreciation of who was doing what and was it effective. Now, when I say, you could read a report and you could hear about things that were happening in Malawi or Sri Lanka or Samoa, but until you got to know the people and realized what was the real capacity of this organization, of the staff of, I think we had 200 plus or something like that. And then there was consultants all over the world doing bits and pieces. One had to get a handle on that before you could really know what your capacity was.
And when you became Secretary General, how many of some of these countries have you actually visited, some of the smaller countries?
By the time I was elected, I would have covered just probably 45 out of the 53.
Well, that is a surprise. That is interesting, right? And what do you consider your greatest achievement, or even two?
Well, it depends on your perspective of this one, Rita, because if you've been judged by the British media, they would have a totally different view. If you're judged by the small states, they would have a different view. If you're judged by the Africans, they would have a different view. And therefore, it would be wrong to say, well, I think it was ultimately staring down Zimbabwe, which became it was a time-consuming issue over a long period of time. All the time, we were trying to convince Robert Mugabe there's a better way of doing things than just creating mayhem at the time of an election and then believing the world was going to forget whatever you did after the election. I found the most interesting challenge was dealing with President Musharraf of Pakistan, because he was a highly intelligent person. He was a successful army officer. He had an absolute hatred of those leaders of the feudal families which so dominated the economy of Pakistan. And in many ways, he was a true democrat. He did want to see the wealth of Pakistan shared more widely, but he could never break down the feudal structures. And of course, as you know, by virtue of that fact and the instability of Pakistan politics, the army became the one sort of stable force in the country, and probably the reason it continues to survive strongly today.
And do you think on occasions like that, what do you think the Commonwealth should be handling this? I mean, do you think suspension or sanctions? What can the Commonwealth do most effectively?
Well, the great thing is, when CMAG was created, they gave the Secretary General a tremendous amount of authority and a range of weapons. They were all soft power weapons. There was no hard power involved here. But I soon found out that if I felt that a Commonwealth leader was really breaching a major Commonwealth principle, that is a very bad election, unilaterally sacking judges, trampling on the opposition, not giving the opposition reasonable rights in Parliament. I could go and see that leader, and I could always say to that leader, your colleagues, your Commonwealth leader colleagues are not happy with the press that you're getting, which is global. They are not happy with the actions that you're taking, which are quite undemocratic. And they want me to talk to you about how you can improve. And because they're saying, unless you do improve, CMAG will be looking over my shoulder and wanting to bring you to court on that matter. Now, that had a remarkable effect. When a Commonwealth leader knows that his fellow leaders are quietly critical of him, not publicly, but quietly critical of him or her, there's a reasonable chance he or she will decide to make changes. Once you've got past that point, you can invariably encourage them to do certain things. Now, you're not trying to clean the slate completely. Let's start with a better electoral structure. That might take a couple of years. Now let's look at your judiciary. That might take a couple of years. Don't believe you can do them all at once. But if you hang in there and ensure that you keep an open dialogue with that leader, spend time with them, don't castigate them publicly, you will make progress. I did with the Gambia, I did with Pakistan, I did with Trinidad, I did with Guyana, I did with Swaziland, with Lesotho, really just getting right alongside them and working with them and making gains. I don't think I was always 100%, but the changes that I was able to encourage and saw implemented told me that this is how you affect change.
And do you think you were able to achieve a lot of this because of your background? I mean, the question, is often asked, what sort of professional or other background do you need to be an effective Secretary General? Is it a politician or a diplomat? And do you think having a background in politics made you more able to deal with the rough and tumble of politicians, other leaders, and get them to treat you as an equal?
Well, let's start at the very end, Rita. The fact that one's been a deputy prime minister and a foreign minister for nearly a decade, you have got an inherent authority. And I noticed that when others who have not had that same status just cannot bring themselves to refer to leaders by their first name. Now, it wasn't the case of just hello Bill, hello Pervez sort of thing, but once you got to know them, to a point, you got onto a first name basis. As to the background, I've thought about this a lot because I look at the procedural processes that organisations go through to select someone like a Secretary General. We saw the Commonwealth, rather the UN more recently when Guterres was appointed. Unfortunately, it just tends to be whose turn, who's probably got the most money, which country has offended the least number of countries in the process, and you go from there. There's very little judgment made on the skills of the person who is putting themselves forward to have that task. And I do say, I think it's an incumbent upon organisations like the Commonwealth, when you are a global body, to go through a far more rigorous selection procedure that ultimately ends up with a political decision. But you need to know that the person you are picking does have a broad range of skills, does have a broad range of experience, does have an ability to work with all people, does have an ability to lead, does have ability to get things done. Now, look, as most people know, I am not from the academic community at all. I barely survived as an agricultural student. But, I spent years working on farms. I worked in prisons. I was in the army. I got into politics and climbed the slippery pole of political ambition. And along the way, you learn a lot about working with people and how you can encourage people to do things they might not want to do. After all, leadership is getting people to do invariably things they don't want to do. So it does require a breadth of skills that come from a variety of places.
We could speak a little later about the selection process and your views, but continuing on the line of staffing and representation now, what do you think about maintaining a balance of getting regional representation within the Commonwealth for special high positions, but also merit? And that can sometimes be very difficult. How did you approach this?
I don't think it was very difficult at all, Rita, because one thing, you always have a lot of very, very good applications for most jobs. I was told often, well, we don't get the best because the best go to the World Bank or the UN, but we get the B team, not the A team. So, well, that never bothered me. The thing is to get the best people. Now, yes, you do have to have broad representation. I didn't constantly count if every country in the Commonwealth was represented in the Secretariat, but I was always aware if there was one country that might have been absent for some time, and that tended to be a small state. The larger states tend to, by virtue of their size, generate people who look for these jobs. When you're looking to appoint a person to head up one of the divisions in the Secretariat, obviously if it's the legal division, clearly you're looking for the person who's hasn't just got legal credentials, but that's the stage where you're looking for people who've got leadership ability. There's an old axiom that the higher you climb the ladder in your own profession, the less you practice your own profession, and the more you practice just straight out people management and leadership. So you have to see that. Now, I would say to you quite candidly, I pick out a person who I believe should be the head of the legal division. That person happens to come from Uganda, and I'm happy with that. A week later, the deputy leaves and I'm advertising for the deputy's position. If the best person who comes forward for that position is from Uganda, they will not get that position, because you just cannot have a head of a division and the deputy from the same country. You're not helping the overall climate of good works in the Secretariat. But let me say this, the difference between the person who could get the job as deputy and the next person who might have come from Tonga, look, there's only going to be 2% between them anyway. So you're not exactly losing a lot by that second person from Uganda not getting the job, as opposed to the person from Tonga getting the job.
That's really interesting. You don't often get a chance about the inner workings, inner thoughts of an organization. And I think what you have to say will be very useful for people who want to know how the Commonwealth works. Thank you. So do you think...
And also you would be, you're looking at some of these divisions within the Secretariat. You know, you've got the African bloc, an Asian bloc, a Pacific bloc, a Caribbean bloc, and a European bloc. And you're always conscious that each one of those blocks should probably be represented somewhere in one of those divisions.
Interesting. Do you think your job was made more difficult by being from the old Commonwealth? And do you think, and because of that, some people felt you might have an agenda?
Oh, yes. Well, it wasn't so much the old Commonwealth, it was the fact that I came from New Zealand, and New Zealand had turned its economic credentials upside down with a whole bunch of new thoughts, which came from the party on the left, really sort of cleaning out the stables of farm subsidies and a whole bunch of things like that, forcing governments to be only policy makers, not running airlines or running railways or running this or running that. getting out of operation, getting the government out of operation. There was, I think, a fear in the Secretariat. Is this man going to turn the Secretariat upside down? Well, in a way, I did have to turn the Secretariat upside down. And the simple reason for that, Rita, was that when I looked at the structure, the budget and how things were working, what I found was that people were staying in the Secretariat a long time, even though there was supposed to be a rotation policy. So I decided we had to get back to a rotation policy that you were good for 2 terms, 2 3-year terms, and you could get a 3rd term. But of course, I was looking at divisions within the Secretariat that had people that had been there 15, 18, 21 years. They just didn't want to leave. And I could understand that. They'd come to the United Kingdom, their kids were in schools. They didn't particularly want to go back to a country which may not have afforded the education but even they had had. But nevertheless, to me, we had to have it. And the big reason we had to have it was the budget, because what we had was a salary structure that was growing at 6% per year and an income that was growing at 1% a year. And the reason it was growing 6% a year was that people would start off at the lower levels of the salary grade and then move up to the top levels, but no one left the top levels. So you had everyone at the top levels of the salary scale, and therefore your salary budget was just getting blown sideways. So there was a reason to have a rotation policy, which was to bring in people at the bottom of the salary scale, get rid of people at the top of the salary scale, send them back to their own country, even though governments bleated about that. And we managed to achieve that. But on top of that also, Rita, was the fact that the pension scheme, because it was attached to Equitable Life, it was a final salary pension scheme, which is the most expensive pension scheme in the world, would become utterly unsustainable. So I had to draw a line under that too and create a whole new pension scheme for staff. So I think that the most pride I got from within the Secretariat was restructuring that whole salary scale, getting the rotation policy in place for staff, changing the superannuation scheme. I could then look governments in the eye and say, I have balanced my budget. I am not wasting money and I'm not asking you for more money. Therefore, when I come to you for money for bigger projects, I want you to say yes. And when they feel that you're keeping your budget tight, that you're spending the money well, especially within the administration, you can invariably convince them to give you more money for projects.
Looking at other developments within the Commonwealth, over the past 30 years or more, Commonwealth professional, NGO and civil society organisations, of course, have come centre stage, are more assertive. Do you think heads of government are doing enough to act on abuses of human rights, freedom of expression and other basic rights?
Probably no, but, and I do agree with you that the Commonwealth, a bunch of NGOs, and I think when at my last count, I think I got someone to do a full, audit of them. I think we had about 87 organisations whose name had Commonwealth in them, and there was some attachment to the Secretariat or the foundation in a way. They all do good work. They're all expected to stand on their own feet. They're all expected to tell us from time to time what they're doing. We adhere to requests whenever we can. But if they raise a particular issue of human rights in 1 or 2 countries, then it's up to the Secretary General to say, pick up that. And I come back to where I started. So the Secretary General then makes a point of going to visit country C, D or E and say, now look, this report's been done. You don't want this to be a black mark against your administration. Let's work together on getting it resolved. And so you're using the NGO's very public comment on a particular deficiency in a country but you are coming there as the friend of the Commonwealth and the friend of that country to help them, resolve the issue. So you're not doing it in a massive public way or sort of shouting from the rooftops. I always thought whenever a foreign minister has to criticize a country through the media, that usually means he's failed.
Interesting. Something to think about. The 2018 summit saw the unprecedented involvement of the British royal family and royal institutions such as Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Do you welcome this, and can we expect greater delegation by the heads of the Commonwealth to members of the royal family in coming years, the British royal family?
Well, I had a wonderful relationship with Her Majesty, and I got to have very good relationships with members of the royal family. And as you probably know from reading my book about this, that I had to say to St. James's Palace, which was where Prince Charles was at the time, look, Prince Charles's travel record in the last 10 years says he's been to, and I'm only sort of guessing, he's been to 50 countries and only 18 of those are Commonwealth countries. Now that to me is not a very good example of the heir to the throne wanting to endear himself to Commonwealth countries. And we had a good few words about that, and I was delighted that he agreed to come to Uganda, to the Chogam in Uganda at the time. And he did a great job there. And I just hope he keeps it up, because his view of the Commonwealth tended to be the view he first got when he started visiting Commonwealth countries in the 70s and 80s. And the Commonwealth changes very rapidly. It did surprise me a little bit the way the British government, of course, the whole thing, you were on the verge of Brexit in that country, and there was clearly some sort of thinking, well, if we're going to leave the European Union, we better once again re-engage with the Commonwealth, because Britain has really did have all the time that I was there, and most of the preceding years, a very detached view of the Commonwealth.
What can the Commonwealth do about COVID-19 and the pandemic, given its tiny institutional presence in global health?
Well, a lot, but in a very sort of not confined, it's not the word, a very well focused way. It was like after 9/11, and the UN said, passed a resolution virtually saying that the best thing could happen now is for all countries to adopt certain modes of security to ensure this doesn't happen again. I said, and they drew up a long list of things that everyone was expected to do, the fencing off of airports and all that sort of thing. I said to Kofi Annan, look, take it from me, I will look after all the small states in the Commonwealth, because we know how they operate. We know how difficult situations can be. How do you fence off an airport which is running out to sea anyway? Things like that. So in a case like COVID-19, if there's one thing the Commonwealth can do, it's help small states deal with these issues. We've always had good people in our sort of health area, and this is one where they could literally go to the small states, the Tuvalus, the Trinidads, the Barbados, and say, look, this is what we've learned from many other countries in dealing with a thing like COVID-19. There's 5 things as a small state you can do probably easier than anyone else. And we would suggest you do that rather than listen to how big countries are handling it. And so this is where I would always say there's a huge role for the Commonwealth in the future, if only to keep looking after 32 small states, because they don't have many champions.
How do you see the future of multilateralism and internationalism itself in a time of rising nationalism, trade wars, and right-wing populism?
Well, look, you never say never. This is a trend the world is going through. It's a very sad trend in the fact that we've got the leadership of a number of countries who are almost trying to, destroy the very fabric of the building up of, well, as much as anything, the Western sort of side of the world, but which has given the world some 75 years of peace. To want to tear down NATO, to want to break up the European Union, and all those sorts of things doesn't bode well. And especially when you're getting this from people who are essentially autocrats. But it seems to me that there's a trend that's been running for some time now. The liberal democracies take a long time to make decisions, and therefore some of those who say, well, I can make decisions faster, just give me a bit more authority and I'll make the decisions. And there's a welling up of sort of enthusiasm for these tough people that'll make decisions rapidly and get on and do things. Now, it won't last forever. It won't last forever. The world needs multilateralism. If we believe that all people should have equal opportunity at the end of the day, that can only come through multilateralism, not through distinct nationalism.
And what do you think of the performance of CMAG? Is it as effective as you had hoped?
Look, Rita, I've not been following CMAG really very closely at all. I touched on it a bit when I was asked to be a special envoy in the Maldives through 2012, 13, or I forget when it was even. It was the very best mechanism which the Secretary General had at his desk to make use of the ability to change the minds of leaders who were doing just the wrong things. So once there was a clear breach of Commonwealth principle, not just Commonwealth principles, but a clear breach of a Commonwealth principle, you had CMAG in your back pocket. And as I said before, you could go and talk to the leader who you believe was in default and really get alongside him and suggest, as I said before, your fellow leaders believe you're giving the Commonwealth a bad name and they're going to start making a noise. I can help you change and that'll help you, it'll help your country. So I think the growth of CMAG during my time as a foreign minister when I was Secretary General, it was pretty active and I think usefully very active.
What do you think, given shrinking resources of the Commonwealth and also its lack of, I suppose, recognition on the international stage at the moment, is there one particular issue that it should really be pushing? For example, the climate crisis?
Well, it should be pushing it anyway because, you've got a whole bunch of small states, and I think within the Commonwealth there are 5 small states that Tuvalu and Kiribati and the Maldives, barely 2 meters above sea level, and they can disappear, and therefore they have an absolute vested interest. But so does the rest of the world should have an interest. Most major cities are just above sea level and are going to have the same problem. So climate change for the sake of sea levels is an absolute, it's made for the Commonwealth, and Commonwealth should push it very hard. Now, look, when you come to scarce resources, I think you've got to look very carefully at this one. There is money there. I proved that I could get money from many sources to use for projects in conjunction working with others. I got a lot of money from the EU for a number of projects. I got money from the World Bank for projects. The main thing is to be able to show to those organizations you run an efficient organization, that you spend the money well, you're not wasting it on things that give you a bad press, You do not want to see the Commonwealth on the front page of British newspapers, because as I say to junior politicians, if you're ever on the front page of the paper, it is for bad news only. It's never for good news. And it's the same with the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is on the front page. It's usually bad news. And I'm sorry the amount of bad news that's been coming out of the Commonwealth in recent times. I'm not following it intimately at all, but what it tells me is that it tells other diplomats that things aren't well. And that's very hard to get money out of governments if their diplomats are saying, well, we're not very happy with what's going on there.
Again, because I think at the moment it's the environment that is becoming a great concern. Recently, countries like India is now destroying ancient forests to build 40 coal mines. There also, Australia is building more coal mines. When one is so worried about the effects of global warming, what can the Commonwealth, and what should the Commonwealth be doing in your view?
Well, you've still got to keep stating these things. Look, the debate in Australia, I know it's almost unwinnable for anybody in Australia apart from the Green Party. But the Commonwealth still has a role to inform people that the production of greenhouse gases is not helping us at all. And this should be well known within the Indian government as well. Big governments of big countries are rather hard to manipulate. You've got to be very, very subtle the way you do it. They do not like to be told by smaller governments of smaller countries or even international organizations what they should be doing. That's why most of what you do as a Secretary General when you are criticizing a government or a leader for a particular action, you've got to do it pretty quietly if you're going to succeed. But climate change is one where you're dealing with the whole country's policy on the use of coal or something like that. It's not going to change easily, but I'm chair of the New Zealand China Council. I'm quite impressed by the changes that China is making. Yes, they're still mining coal for energy, but their dependence on coal for energy is actually diminishing quite rapidly in relation to a host of other areas.
And finally, and this is quite a big question with many bits to it, but what do you think will be the role of the Commonwealth in 50 years of time? Will it still exist? And if so, why? Will the royal connection be preserved, or will it be replaced? And if so, by what? And has the fact that the monarch served as the head of Commonwealth been of value to the survival, utility, and success of the Commonwealth? If so, why? You could choose one or choose all of them if you want to. You've got
well, let's just start at the beginning. When I came to live in England in 2000 to take over the job as a sort of a egalitarian New Zealander, I thought, the monarchy just cannot last forever because ultimately it'll become redundant. Well, you only have to live in the United Kingdom, a couple of years, you realise that the monarchy is so much built into the fabric of the DNA of the British people, it is not going to disappear tomorrow. And when you realise that everything that's attached to the monarchy, the patronage, the House of Lords, host of appointments and things, to try and change all those and create an elected presidency, I just don't see it happening in the time of my grandchildren. So to me, the Commonwealth, the monarchy is going to be there forever, despite possibly the quality of any of the incumbents in years ahead. The present incumbent is just extraordinary. And as I've said about Prince Charles, I think he struggled to be the Prince of Wales, but I believe he will make a much better king than he has been a Prince of Wales. And Prince William, he seems to be all moving in the right direction. But as the Commonwealth itself, my answer to this is usually, I cannot believe that a group of 50 nations, all who have so much in common, who speak the same language, and I don't mean the English language, they speak the same language of the institutions. It's the parliamentary institutions, it's the educational institutions, it's the judicial institutions, it's the health systems. They are so similar. It's not until they start getting together, when ministers of health get together, ministers of education get together, ministers of sport get together, energy ministers they realize they've got a heck of a lot in common. I cannot believe that 53 countries would see it a disadvantage to allow themselves to break up. It may not play the most prominent part in the lives of that government or of that country. And I do insist, when I used to talk to countries about this, I said, look how much you're spending on belonging to the UN, or belonging to the Commonwealth, or belonging to NATO, or belonging to the Pacific Forum. Have you worked out whether you're getting value for money? Because, as you probably know, I did this some years ago, the amount of money the UK spends on belong to the European Union, £50 a head, belong to NATO about £10 a head, and belong to the Commonwealth about £1 a head. So I always thought they got good value out of it. But the Commonwealth has to be able to sustain its relevance and credibility. What is it doing, not just today, what's it going to do tomorrow? And is it doing it right? Is it seen by others to be doing the good sort of work that people want to continue to invest in it? And I would insist, if you've got good staff and you've got good programs and you're showing that you're getting good results, you won't have any trouble bringing in resources.
And before we end, we have to mention, of course, your Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, is acclaimed universally as a leader who's doing all the right things. And do you see her, or even maybe Helen Clark at some stage, actually heading the Commonwealth one day?
Well, I see a lot of Helen Clark these days. She and I are involved in 2 or 3 things together. I think, like me, she's done her international bit of a permanent sort of, tenured nature. As for Jacinda Ardern, you're right, she's absolutely remarkable. She has just managed to tap into the emotions of all New Zealanders over the Christchurch massacre, over the White Island volcanic furor, and more recently over the COVID-19, and she's handled it exceptionally well. She's got a lot of good people around her, and that's good, but she's still a very young person, so she's still got many years in front of her, and I would not know what she's thinking now, except for the fact we're supposed to be having an election in 5 weeks' time, and due to COVID-19, that may be problematical.
Thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts, insights with us. And I think all our colleagues here wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita. My pleasure.